Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something pretty fascinating,
Yeah.
and it was inspired by a book you shared with me, The Expressive Body in Life, Art, and Therapy, working with movement, metaphor, and meaning.
Yeah.
And just the title alone, I was like, whoa, this looks like it's going to get deep.
Yeah, it does. It's a really, really good book. And one of the things I really appreciated right away was how personal it felt. The author, Daria Halprin, she mentions her family right in the acknowledgments,
Oh, wow.
including her parents, who, Anne and Lawrence Halprin, who were huge figures in the arts. And so it almost felt less like a purely academic work and more like this kind of distillation of her own personal experiences.
Yeah.
And the work that she does at the Tamalpa Institute, which she co-founded.
And that's what I think is so interesting because reading through it myself, it's not just like a textbook about the body. It's so much more about, like you said, her life, her experiences, and what she's learned and kind of formulated into this approach.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we want to really dig into today in this deep dive, to understand how this particular approach, we're calling it expressive arts therapy, how it actually functions,
Mhm.
what are the core principles behind it, and I think crucially, how it serves as a bridge between our inner lives and our day-to-day lived experiences. How does it help us understand ourselves better, through movement, through art, through this evocative power of metaphor.
Yeah,
So it's a pretty big topic.
it is. It's a lot to cover.
Yeah.
I mean, where do we even begin?
I know. Well, the book starts off with this really central idea, which I think kind of underpins everything else.
Sure.
And that's the idea that our bodies aren't just these passive vessels, but that they're fundamental to how we experience and understand the world.
Okay.
Our bodies are like the vehicles of our awareness.
Hmm.
And she talks about this constant dynamic interplay between our physical sensations, what we feel in our bodies, our emotions, and our thoughts. And there's this key concept that I found really intriguing, which is movement as metaphor.
Yeah,
This idea that the way we move physically can actually reflect who we are, our personal histories, and even those patterns that we might keep repeating in our lives.
that's right.
So help me unpack that a little bit. Movement as metaphor. I mean, are we just talking about like, when you get angry, you clench your fists,
Right.
kind of those obvious physical manifestations of emotion? Or is there something more to it?
Well, it is that, but it's also so much more than that. It's about recognizing that even our habitual postures, like the way we stand or sit, the gestures we make, even like the overall quality of our movement, whether it's very fluid and expansive or whether it's more tight and restricted, whether it's full of energy or sort of hesitant, all of these things actually carry meaning.
Yeah.
They
Okay.
can be seen as expressions of our inner state,
Yeah.
and they can also often reveal really deeply ingrained patterns that we might not even be consciously aware of. So, think about someone who feels chronically insecure. They might habitually hunch their shoulders,
Yeah.
right? And so that posture can be a metaphor for how they kind of carry themselves in the world.
It's so interesting because it's true. Our bodies do hold on to those experiences and those emotions. I know when I'm stressed, I clench my jaw.
Hmm.
Or when I'm sad, I feel this heaviness in my chest. So it sounds like she's taking this inherent connection between our bodies and our inner lives and really developing a whole therapeutic approach around it.
That's exactly right. And, the ultimate aim of this work, according to Halprin, is really to help us live what she calls a life well lived. And she sees that as deeply connected to this kind of three-way connection between art, psychology, and even spirituality. And it's important, I think, to understand that this approach, while it certainly has applications in a clinical setting in terms of therapy, it actually goes way beyond that.
Yeah.
It's really about cultivating a more conscious, a more creative, a more what she calls artful way of being in the world.
I love that phrase, living artfully.
Yeah.
That really resonates with me. It's like it suggests a more intentional, more imaginative kind of engagement with life itself.
Right.
Now, the book itself, it seems like it really has this personal origin for Halprin.
It does. She bravely shares a lot of her own life story right at the beginning.
Oh, wow.
And, she talks about her experiences growing up in the avant-garde art scene of the 1960s, which was, incredibly vibrant and kind of unconventional. And she even talks about performing nude.
Whoa.
And she talks about the discrepancies that she observed between, the seemingly liberated atmosphere of the studio of the art world and then the more traditional expectations that she faced in her own home life.
That must have been a really kind of tricky thing to navigate, as a young person, those different realms of
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah, it was. And she really grappled with this,
Mm-hmm.
with this kind of gap. And she talks about how this personal grounding, her own journey
Yeah.
of seeking to kind of reintegrate these different parts of herself and to heal her own internal conflicts, through art, how that was absolutely crucial to the development of her therapeutic approach.
Yeah.
It wasn't just some abstract academic pursuit for her. It came directly out of her own life, her own questions,
Yeah.
her own search for a sense of wholeness.
So out of those personal experiences, these keen observations of herself and her environment, she really started to formulate some of the foundational principles of this work,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, so there are several key ideas that really form the foundation of this work.
Okay.
The first is that our bodies, like we said, are our primary means of experiencing and understanding the world. They're vehicles of awareness. The second is that there is this deep and reciprocal connection between our physical body, our emotions, and our thoughts. These aren't separate things. They're all constantly communicating with each other, influencing each other.
Right. I can't really separate, the emotion of embarrassment from like my face flushing,
Exactly.
or my heart racing. It's
Yeah.
like they're completely interconnected.
Yeah, they are.
Okay.
The third principle is that, our body sensations, our habitual postures, the gestures we make, they hold a kind of embodied history.
Mm-hmm.
They reflect our past experiences,
Yeah.
both the good and the bad.
Right.
The fourth principle is that movement itself can be a really powerful way to kind of reveal these underlying patterns.
Yeah.
And also a path towards change, towards new possibilities.
Okay.
And then the final one, the fifth one, is that this act of connecting our inner experience with our outer expression, bringing what's internal into some kind of tangible form, whether it's through art, through movement, through sound, whatever, that is really vital for growth and healing.
Okay, so those are kind of like the building blocks, right, of her approach.
Exactly.
And now the outline mentions historical context. So it sounds like this work didn't just kind of appear out of nowhere.
It did not, no. And actually, she really delves into a fascinating kind of network of influences.
Okay.
And it highlights how ideas from different fields, seemingly disparate fields, have really kind of cross-pollinated over time.
Okay.
And there are a few key areas that she really focuses on. Psychology, of course, somatics, which are body-based practices that really emphasize the felt sense of experience, what we feel physically in our bodies. Dance, and then modern and postmodern art.
Okay, let's explore those a little bit. How did the field of psychology specifically contribute to this approach?
Well, she draws on a pretty wide range of psychological thinking. From the Freudian and Jungian perspectives, there's this whole idea of the unconscious mind and how it expresses itself through symbols and metaphors.
Right.
But she also brings in the humanistic approaches, people like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow,
Yeah.
who really emphasize this idea of, our inherent potential for self-actualization and this drive towards growth.
Right.
She also talks about Gestalt therapy, which really focuses on present moment awareness, and then this idea of, experiential enactment, kind of bringing things to life in the present moment. And then psychosynthesis, which is a really interesting approach that even incorporates spirituality.
Okay.
And then perhaps most significantly, she talks about the influence of pioneers like Wilhelm Reich
Okay.
on somatic psychology, who really explored how the body physically holds and reflects our psychic processes, our emotional history.
So it's a very rich kind of tapestry of different psychological ideas that are being woven into this approach.
Yeah, exactly.
No, dance. That seems like a very direct and obvious connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And, she really traces this evolution of dance from, the more traditional classical forms, to the emergence of modern dance, which really started to emphasize individual self-expression and, a more natural, less codified way of moving.
Yeah.
And that, of course, really paved the way for the development of dance movement therapy as a distinct therapeutic discipline.
Okay.
And she talks about key figures like Marion Chase, Mary Stark's White House,
Okay.
and White House, for example, she really emphasized this idea of authentic movement.
Mm-hmm.
She had the famous quote, "The body is the personality made visible."
Oh, wow.
And she also talks about Anna Halprin, who was her mother,
Okay, yeah.
who's actually recognized as the first postmodern dancer. And, was a major figure in really establishing dance as a healing art.
Yeah.
Incorporating all these different artistic disciplines into her work, and also, very directly addressing relevant social and cultural themes, in her work.
So it's not just about kind of individual therapy, but also looking at the broader context of society and culture.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then we have the influences of modernism and postmodernism. How did these artistic movements shape this approach?
Well, I think they represent a really significant shift from earlier ways of understanding both the world and art itself.
Okay.
Modernism, broadly speaking, really challenged the Enlightenment emphasis on reason and logic.
Mm-hmm.
It questioned established power structures, traditional forms, and then postmodernism kind of built on that
Yeah.
and really emphasized the importance of integrating diverse perspectives, recognizing that there was value in everyday life,
Right.
and intentionally blurring the boundaries between art and life itself,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps most famously through these things called happenings.
Right.
And so this heightened value placed on sensory perception,
Mm-hmm.
on, recognizing and embracing diversity.
Yeah.
And the idea that even ordinary events could hold this really profound metaphoric significance.
Yeah.
These were all really key shifts in thinking
Yeah.
that, influence new approaches in therapy
Yeah.
and education. And interestingly enough, she even talks about how developments in modern science, things like Einstein's theory of relativity,
Oh, wow.
also kind of reflected this movement towards a concept of inherent harmony and energy
Yeah.
within the universe.
So we see these echoes in different fields.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. So it's like a real melting pot of ideas from psychology, from somatics, from dance, from art.
Yeah.
And it's out of this kind of intellectual and artistic melting pot that expressive arts therapy kind of emerges as a distinct approach.
Exactly. It's really presented as this kind of, powerful synthesis of all these diverse influences.
Okay.
And it intentionally uses what she calls intermodal arts,
Okay.
which is basically this dynamic interplay between different art forms.
Yeah.
Movement, drama, voice, visual arts, writing,
Right.
to foster self-awareness, to unlock creativity,
Yeah.
and ultimately to facilitate change and growth.
Mm-hmm.
And the core idea is that, this interaction between psychological processes and artistic processes is really where a lot of the magic happens,
Yeah.
Where the insight and transformation can occur.
Okay.
And she briefly introduces a couple of kind of interesting concepts. One is called crystallization theory,
Okay.
which was developed by Paulo Nil.
Mm-hmm.
And it suggests that, engaging with art can help bring unconscious material into clearer focus, make it more understandable.
Okay.
And then she also talks about this concept of decentering through art,
Okay.
which is this idea that, when we engage with art, we can kind of step outside of our usual perspectives and see ourselves and our experiences in new ways.
Yeah.
And that can be really powerful.
That makes sense. Now, there are some core questions that it sounds like really drove the development of these different fields. And I'm assuming then, this therapeutic approach.
Yeah.
So what were those key questions that kept coming up?
Well, there are three central questions that she identifies as being kind of, fundamental throughout this whole history.
Okay.
The first is, how do we understand and effectively explore those tensions and conflicts that exist both within individuals and within society?
Okay.
Right. The second is, how can these often opposing forces be reconciled in a way that's creative and productive and leads to greater integration?
Yeah.
And the third one is, what role do our bodies, our emotions, and the power of imagination play in all of this?
Mm-hmm.
So those are kind of the big questions that she's really engaging with.
So it's not just about like fixing a problem or, it's about this bigger, more holistic exploration of ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And she talks about this 3 levels of awareness and response model. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's one of the kind of foundational models within her approach.
Oh, yeah.
And it emphasizes the importance of working experientially and metaphorically with our physical, our emotional, and our mental levels of being.
Okay.
So the goal is to become more aware of and then to actively work through any restrictive patterns that might be present.
Mm-hmm.
across these levels, right?
Okay.
So we want to expand the range and flexibility of our responses to life
Yeah.
and to explore these responses through different art mediums.
Okay.
So, for example, someone might begin by noticing a particular physical sensation
Mm-hmm.
and then explore the emotions that come up in connection with that sensation.
Right.
And then maybe discover a related mental image or narrative
Mm-hmm.
that gives them even more insight.
Okay.
So it's about cultivating a greater kind of fluidity and connection between these different aspects of ourselves.
Yeah, I like that. It's kind of like, we're not just our thoughts or just our feelings or just our bodies. It's like we're this integrated whole.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, there's this exploration of movement itself in more detail. Like, how does she approach observing and working with movement?
Well, she draws on the work of Laban and Bartneff,
Okay.
who developed these really comprehensive systems for analyzing and describing movement.
Okay.
And, they'd look at elements like how we use space,
Mm-hmm.
the quality of our timing,
Yeah.
the amount of force we exert,
That's
the
okay.
shape our bodies make.
Okay.
And so, this provides a kind of shared language for understanding movement.
Right.
And then she introduces this really practical cycle for movement exploration that she calls repeat, develop, switch, shift.
Repeat, develop, switch, shift.
Yeah. And it's a way to kind of build resources in our movement vocabulary
Okay.
and to work with the natural flow of movement and, associated feelings and images that come up.
Okay.
And then she also talks about coaching techniques that can help bring greater awareness to our own movement patterns.
So, repeat, develop, switch, shift. That sounds like a really intentional way to really kind of get into the nuances of how we move.
It is.
Now, what about the role of improvisation in all of this?
Improvisation is huge.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like that would be a core component of expressive arts.
It really is. It's presented as a really powerful tool for accessing those deeper layers of the unconscious,
Mm-hmm.
often bypassing the censor of our conscious mind.
Right.
And allows for this really fertile ground where the unconscious and the conscious can kind of meet and interact
Yeah.
in the creative act.
Okay.
And she talks about how it's so important for not only fostering creativity, but also spontaneity
Yeah.
and this greater capacity to kind of work with the unexpected.
Yeah.
Those curveballs that life throws at us. And she also outlines some key principles for effective improvisation, like, embracing what we might call mistakes
Right.
and staying really present in the moment.
So being okay with not knowing what's going to happen next.
It's about kind of going at the flow.
Yeah, being in the flow.
Yeah. Now, there's this 5-part therapeutic process
Mm-hmm.
that sounds like it's kind of a central framework for the therapy itself.
Yeah, it is. It's this, model that offers a structured but also flexible way to guide these therapeutic encounters.
Okay.
And the 5 phases are identification, where a central image, a feeling, a concern is brought into focus.
Mm-hmm.
Then confrontation, where you really immerse yourself in that material
Okay.
through movement, art, other modalities.
Okay.
Then release,
Yeah.
which is about facilitating a release of held impulses, tensions, emotions
Okay.
through full expression. Then change,
Yeah.
where new possibilities emerge from that release,
Okay.
And then finally growth, which is about integrating those new insights and choices into our daily life.
Okay. So it's almost like a journey
Yeah.
from kind of identifying what's there to confronting it, releasing it, and then allowing something new to emerge and then integrate that. Exactly. And it's often a cyclical process.
Right.
You might go through those stages multiple times.
Right. Yeah.
In a given session even.
Okay. And then there's this psychokinetic imagery model that sounds really intriguing.
Yeah. This is it's a specific intermodal arts model that uses a sequence of drawing, movement, and dialogue.
Okay.
So the idea is that each art form engages different sensory pathways and connects with different facets of our experience.
Yeah.
So, drawing might tap into the visual, the imaginative. Movement allows us to connect with our kinesthetic and emotional selves in a more direct way.
Mm.
And then the dialogue helps bring meaning to the images and to the experiences
Right.
and keeps the spoken word connected to that initial aesthetic exploration.
Okay, so it's not just talking about a feeling.
Right,
It's
yeah.
like embodying it through movement.
Yeah.
And then giving it visual form through drawing.
Exactly.
And then verbal language through dialogue.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
It can be really powerful.
Yeah. Now, she gets into this really fascinating section on body part metaphors.
Yeah.
So how does that work in practice?
Well, the idea is that different parts of our body carry their own metaphoric qualities,
Okay.
you know, and that these can be really powerful entry points into our life stories
Yeah.
and our emotional and psychological themes.
Okay.
So, for each specific body part, she outlines its functions,
Mm-hmm.
common associations that we have with that body part,
Yeah.
and then potential themes that might arise for exploration.
Okay.
And she also provides some really wonderful practical warm-up exercises that integrate both movement and drawing.
Okay, so for example, what kind of themes or metaphors might be associated with, like, the head and face?
Well, the head, as the center of our thinking, our perception, our communication,
Mm-hmm.
it's often associated with these themes around mask and unmask,
Okay.
exploring how we present ourselves outwardly versus, our inner thoughts and feelings, our true self.
Right.
The spine, which is our central support structure,
Mm.
it might bring up themes related to our posture in life, what supports us, literally and metaphorically,
Yeah.
feelings of strength and vulnerability.
Okay.
The rib cage, which protects our heart, can evoke themes of emotional protection, vulnerability, maybe unexpressed grief or joy.
Okay.
So, in essence, each part of the body becomes this kind of symbolic landscape for deeper self-exploration.
And these aren't just theoretical ideas. Like, she provides actual exercises that people can do to connect with these metaphors.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. For each body part, there are specific movement explorations and guided drawing prompts,
Okay.
to help individuals really establish this connection with the metaphoric meanings held within that part of themselves.
Wow.
And, she emphasizes throughout the importance of movement exploration as a means of releasing emotions and fostering change.
Mm-hmm.
And she even talks about, how to work with these body part metaphors in group settings,
Oh, interesting.
which can be really powerful.
Yeah. Wow. So it's like almost like the body becomes a living archive
Yeah,
of all of our experiences, both the conscious and the unconscious ones.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It holds so much wisdom.
Yeah. Okay. Now the final section of this deep dive focuses on living artfully with the wounded self.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds like it really gets to the core of the healing potential of this approach.
It really does. It addresses how, the principles and practices of expressive arts therapy can provide pathways for us to, gently and effectively engage with our past wounds
Mm-hmm.
and to facilitate the integration of those experiences.
Right.
And she talks about, the work of Alice Miller,
Okay.
who wrote about the lasting impact of early childhood experiences,
Yeah.
and Winnicott's concept of creative play
Mm-hmm.
as essential for recovery.
Okay.
And she really highlights the role of the therapist or the teacher
Yeah.
as a witness,
Mm-hmm.
as someone who can provide a safe and containing space for this kind of exploration.
I think that's so important, that idea of a safe space when you're dealing with, things that can be very sensitive, right?
Absolutely. And she also makes a connection to Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Okay.
suggesting how, unresolved wounding can interfere with our ability to move towards self-actualization,
Right.
to fulfill our potential.
Right.
And she introduces this really potent metaphor of a descent into darkness,
Okay.
kind of like the myth of Jonah,
Mm-hmm.
as a necessary stage in the journey towards meeting our true selves.
That's really powerful, that idea that, sometimes we have to face those darker parts of ourselves
Yeah.
to really emerge, transformed.
Yeah, to find the light.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she actually outlines the structured 8-act play framework for working with the wounded self in a group setting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. So it involves these different stages,
Mm-hmm.
setting the stage,
Okay.
creating a space for this work.
Yeah.
There's an invocation
Okay.
to kind of set an intention.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this really interesting part where you develop a character
Okay.
that represents the wounded aspect of yourself.
Oh, wow.
And you actually define their baseline state, their wants, their needs.
Oh, yeah.
And then you explore their boundaries through this metaphor of a costume.
Oh, wow.
And then there's a period of individual reflection and contemplation
Mm-hmm.
using a timeline mural.
Okay.
And then there's a ritualized enactment of the character's story,
Wow.
a creative meditation,
Okay.
and then a closing.
Okay.
So it's really this beautifully structured but also very creative container for this kind of deep work.
Yeah. And the outline mentions that she includes some case studies
Yes.
that really show how this works in practice.
Yeah, they're really compelling case studies.
Right.
And they show how, um, using movement, drawing, dialogue within this framework
Mm-hmm.
can lead to, you know, emotional release,
Yeah.
confrontation of difficult truths,
Mm-hmm.
and ultimately really profound change.
Yeah. And she also emphasizes the importance of healthy boundaries,
Absolutely.
in our relationships and in the world.
Yeah.
And provides exercises for, exploring old boundary patterns and establishing new ones.
Exactly.
So as we kind of come to the end of this deep dive, it really seems like the expressive body has revealed this really powerful and multifaceted approach to understanding ourselves and healing.
It has.
So what would you say are some of the key takeaways for our listener?
I would say the most important takeaway is that we can understand ourselves on a much deeper level by paying attention to the language of our bodies,
Mm-hmm.
by engaging in creative expression, and by exploring the metaphors that arise from this process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also really important to remember that this isn't just about therapy.
Right.
It's about integrating this sense of artfulness and creativity into our everyday lives
Yeah.
as a pathway to greater self-awareness and well-being.
Right. And for you, our listener, who really values knowledge and insight but doesn't want to be overwhelmed, this framework offers a really structured yet creative way to tap into deeper levels of understanding and to address personal challenges.
Yeah.
And this emphasis on embodiment, on the interconnectedness of mind, body, and spirit, provides a holistic perspective that, goes beyond just intellectual understanding.
Yeah.
So here's a thought for you to consider, or our listener, as you, continue on your own journey. What if our deepest wisdom and our greatest potential for healing isn't just in our thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
but also in the language of our bodies and in our capacity for creative expression?
Yeah.
What might shift for you if you started to pay attention to these often overlooked aspects of yourself?
It's a really powerful invitation.
Yeah. And if this has piqued your interest at all, we encourage you to explore the work of Daria Halprin and the Tamalpa Institute further. And